Well, it's a Friday night and I'm stir crazy. I've been inside for the past 3 days for the vast majority of the time, as we've had no school due to the snow here in Oklahoma and the lack of infrastructure to deal with snow. So I figured I'd walk the mile to Brahms to get some ice cream, and at the same time I figured I'd tell an oral history of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. It's my version, it's not a complete version. There are better works written on the subject, but I believe that I can at least provide some historical context to the area where I grew up. So I'm from southern Minnesota. Grew up just 20 minutes away from the Minnesota River Valley. For those of you who don't have access to a map, the Minnesota River Valley looks like if you were to make a finger pistol with your right hand and then point it upwards to the left at about a 30-degree angle. So on the left side is the headwaters of the Minnesota River, where the Minnesota River reaches Lake Traverse and turns, Minnesota reaches Lake Traverse and turns into the actual Minnesota River. As you move along towards your towards the knuckles on your middle finger, where your pointer finger or index finger reaches your hand, that will be Fort Ridgely, then New Ulm, Minnesota. On the bottom, in the crook where your thumb meets your hand, that'll be Mankato, and then up at the top right will be the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, before it meets the Mississippi River and flows south to the Atlantic. So, having put that mental map in your mind, my childhood was interesting. And one of the more interesting parts of it was geographic location. I've heard many people say that out on the prairies of Minnesota is rather boring, but there was so much history in our backyard that we took for granted. My grade school would have an annual Fort Day where all the kids from K to 8 would go out to Fort Ridgely for a day. Fort Ridgely is both a Minnesota historic site and a state park, and we would go hiking and everybody would pack a lunch. You'd bring a kickball along and play some kickball. The big event was always tug of war. So you'd set up like the third graders versus the eighth graders, and the eighth graders would win unless there were only 4 of them. And then you'd start combining classes. So, okay, the third graders and the eighth graders versus the fifth graders and the sixth graders, and so on until you have had just a jolly good time. But where we would be doing this would be about 2 football fields away, 200 yards away from the ruins of a Civil War era fort that was on the frontier, and it was the gateway to the frontier. The last meaningful fort before you reach to the Badlands of South Dakota. And so, this is where our story is set, but some background first. There were many treaties signed between the United States federal government and the Dakota, or the Sioux, the Native Americans of southern Minnesota. In 1951, the treaties of Traverse de Sioux, signed in St. Peter, and the Treaty of Mendota, signed in Mendota, were basically, it was a document of sale for the lands that the Dakota people held in southern Minnesota. In exchange for all of these millions of acres of land and the document that said they were the rightful owners of, the United States was the rightful owners of it, the Dakota peoples got a 20-mile wide stretch along the Minnesota River that was 150 miles long. So 3,000 total square miles. This was a vast reduction from the tens of thousands of square miles of land they held before. But along with this reservation, the Dakota were to receive monthly payments in gold and food. However, like most of the treaties that the United States government signed, the treaties of 1851 were not honored in the slightest. The United States government had a habit of encouraging the Dakota to indebt themselves to traders. So most of the monthly payments would be, instead of being given to the Dakota peoples who were promised those payments, would be given for debts owed to the traders. And because the traders would happily work on credit, they would report to the government, this is how much I am owed, and then that money would, instead of being sent to the peoples whose money it was, for them to pay their debts, that money went directly to the traders. And because there are many unscrupulous men now, and have been throughout history, there were many reports of traders who would just make up debts. So you'd fictionalize your accounts to take a little bit extra off the top. Along with that, on a report from early 1862 by a lawyer who was hired by the U.S. government to oversee Indian affairs and the distribution of the parts of the treaty, many of the agents who were physically distributing the money and the food were accruing massive amounts of wealth. For example, one man, it was reported, had accrued $100,000 in 4 years on a $2,000 a year salary. And many men with $1,500 a year salaries were also getting rich. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot in today's day and age, but remember, this is 1862. This is the middle of the Civil War. You could get a pair of shoes for less than $11. Things were much cheaper back then. So the amount of money that was being embezzled and stolen from the Dakota was absolutely massive. Things came to a head in August of 1862. The United States government was 2 months behind on food and gold payments. Not only were they 2 months behind, they had the food, but they were unwilling to distribute it to the peoples without the accompanying gold payments. And the Dakota people were starving. When Little Crow, a couple years before, had gone to Washington to ask for the full payment of food and gold, instead of getting what he demanded, the Dakota lost all of their land north of the Minnesota River, effectively cutting the size of their reservation in half. And because the settlers who moved in, very quickly might I add, were very good at deforesting and plowing up any available prairie, this left very little land for the Dakota to actually hunt and gather as they had before. So this confluence of events led to widespread starvation. And in August of 1862, there was a problem. So, on the 17th, some young Dakota warriors went north to Acton. And there they were at a farm, and some stories say that they were scouting out the best way to steal chicken eggs from a settler there. But they were confronted, and after a heated exchange, the local farmer was persuaded into a shooting match. So, the farmer and his son went against the Dakota warriors, and after a fair few rounds of shooting at a stump, the Dakota warriors turned on the settler and his family, killed them, and in total 5 died at their hands. Ashamed, they fled back to the band at the reservation and reported on what had been done. It was these actions that that were the spark that lit the keg of powder and started the war. So on August 18th, decisive action needed to be taken. The Dakota met in their first battle with U.S. forces at the Battle of Redwood Ferry, which, if you've got your finger gun map pointed up, would be at about the knuckle on your index finger, the second knuckle, one closer to your hand. And it was a quick victory for the Dakota. Alongside this victory, bands roved around, terrifying settlers, slaughtering settlers, and taking hostage many women and children. So some townships and settlements that were wiped out, nearly exterminated, were Milford and Leavenworth. And that first day of terror led many settlers in the region to flee to Fort Ridgely. Fort Ridgely was the biggest U.S. military presence in the region. However, Fort Ridgely had no walls, so it was difficult to defend. But still, the overwhelming presence there meant that it would not be the first attacked. Also on the 18th, the trader Thomas Gilbraith, federal representative of the federal government and a trader, when asked for what they should do, and if the Dakota could get food on credit, Gilbraith said, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." In this callous response, he ensured his own fate. Because he said that earlier, on the 18th, the Lower Sioux Agency was taken, And Gilbraith, his dead body was found with his mouth stuffed full of grass. So the Dakota raided on the 18th the Lower Sioux Agency and took from within any food and gold they could scrounge up. So we moved to the 19th. A second day, many settlers have fled the countryside. Many others have died. We go now to New Ulm, a thriving city of a few thousand people along the Minnesota River. Not directly on top of it, as many river cities are, but rather built in the valley with the river kind of just there as well. And New Ulm was a mostly German settlement, and its people were frightened. So they threw together a defense. They barricaded a few blocks of downtown and sat and waited. And the attack came on August 19th. The attack was vicious. Out of the however many buildings in the town, all but a few were burned, and anyone outside of the barricaded area was taken hostage or killed. So with that successful defense, but terrifying prospect, the next day, the Dakota, emboldened by quick victories at Redwood Ferry and New Ulm, attacked, or rather assaulted, Fort Ridgely. So Fort Ridgely is situated along the bluffs of the Minnesota River. So it is on top of a bluff with ravines on three sides. And it was out of these ravines that the Dakota warriors attacked. The defenders of Fort Ridgely held on strong throughout the day of the 20th. The 21st, there was no fighting due to the rain, but the supply caravan meant to aid Fort Ridgely was intercepted on its way from New Ulm that day. And on the 21st, the attack commenced once again. There were many volunteers who defended the fort, along with a small presence of U.S. soldiers. And there were a few cannons on the ground. One of the stories that I've been told during my time going to Fort Ridgely was that during the battle, one of the wives of a cannoneer the wife of the postmaster opened up the front and back doors, and since the house was small in the day, you could see right through the parlor, through the front door, out the back. They lined up a cannon through it and fired it, apparently scoring a hit. But overall, the fort was successfully defended in the Battle of Fort Ridgely on August 20th and 22nd. The next day, the 23rd, New Ulm was once again attacked, and they were staved off by Judge Flandreau, after which a state park in the town is named, who valiantly charged at the attacking bands and ultimately drove them off. There's some interesting stories that you can find going around downtown New Ulm, such as the story of the Aird building, where all the women and children were kept, along with a barrel of gunpowder, and one of the women was given a match and was told Should the Dakota ever get into the basement of the Air building, the city was lost. She should strike the match and take down the building upon the gathered people therein. However, having been turned away from the heart of New Ulm and Fort Ridgely, the Dakota retreated. They gathered their forces further north, or on your finger gun map, towards the left. And the U.S. government finally sent reinforcements to help defend the settlers. But the thing about the reinforcements was that this was in the middle of the Civil War. The all-out war between the North and the South to preserve the Union and to dissolve it. So there were not many fighting men left. But something like the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th Minnesota Volunteer regiments, which were still being formed at the time, were mustered and marched out to Fort Ridgely to help with the war efforts there. And they made it out on the 28th of August. On the 31st of August, Colonel Sibley, former governor of Minnesota, and overall not a friend to the Dakotas, he sent a burial party along the river to find the corpses of settlers who'd been killed, along with the corpses of soldiers who had been killed. So with this task, they set up camp, and on the 31st, they set out on the 31st, and on the 3rd of September, at the break of dawn, they were ambushed by the Dakota at what is now called the Battle of Birch Coulee. In this battle, there were the greatest military losses of any battle of the war. After the Battle of Birch Coulee, there was not a whole lot of fighting, but rather a lot of raiding and preparing to be raided and defending. Things came to a head in September, finally, when on the 23rd, the forces of General Sibley moved west once more toward Wood Lake. Dakota Scouts had been keeping tabs on Sibley's forces, and there were parties who wanted to attack Sibley's camp at night. But upon receiving news that there were breastworks at Sibley's camp, this plan was called off and in favor of an assault, while the forces of General Sibley Captain Sibley were moving west once more on the road. However, this ambush was ruined when, early on the morning of the 23rd, an unauthorized expedition left Sibley's camp to go forage for potatoes at the Upper Sioux Agency, and this expedition was ambushed, and thus started the fighting at the Battle of Wood Lake. Now, this battle was the final decisive battle of the war. 3 days later, at Camp Release, the Dakota Peace Party surrendered somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 hostages, many of whom were of mixed descent. They had both white and Dakota heritage. So, in the aftermath of the war, there was a hasty military tribunal with as many as 20 people being tried in one day. And of the 404 Dakota to be charged, over 300 were convicted and sentenced to death. President Lincoln pardoned all but 39. And so, later, in 1862, there were 39 nooses set up in Mankato, Minnesota. However, on the day of the execution, word came from President Lincoln that there was dubious evidence in the trials of one of the men, so his execution was to be stayed. So in the end, 38 Dakota men were hung in Mankato, Minnesota. And this was not the end of the fighting between Dakota and the U.S. government, but conflicts moved further west. Little Crow, who had led the Dakota, had fled north. And this war, called the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, or the Sioux Uprising, or Little Crow's War, depending on who you ask, this war was concluded. So in the span of a month and 5 days, there were around 100 U.S. military losses, 350 U.S. settler deaths, and around 150 Dakota killed in conflict, plus an additional 38 executed. Alright, well, it's about 23 degrees Fahrenheit here at 8:14, and I've just had a lovely ice cream sundae. There's nothing like ice cream to ward away a cold day. And I'd like to go over, as an epilogue to my oral history about the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, some of the modern day impacts that the war has had. So one of the biggest impacts is that 150-mile long Dakota reservation that was cut in half earlier now is almost entirely gone. Very little land remains under Dakota control. Most of the Dakota peoples after the war were rounded up, sent further west into other Dakota lands, but just because we use the same overarching term Dakota for them doesn't mean that they were the same peoples. Just like you couldn't forcibly move a bunch of people from Georgia into Oklahoma and expect them to not complain, even though they're both Southerners. They should get along. As you go through cities along the Minnesota River, you'll find historical markers. So, in New Ulm, the entire downtown, which was barricaded off by its defenders, you'll find historical markers on buildings and historical markers that point out where Flandreau's charge happened, or, hey, this is the Kiesling House, one of the few residences that survived the war, and the attacks on New Ulm because it was within the barricade. The city of New Ulm still stands today. Around 14,000 people live there. Still has heavy Germanic influence. Still holds the United States' second oldest continually owned and operating family-owned brewery, Shell's Brewery, which survived the war. It was started up, I believe, around 1855, before the state of Minnesota came to be. And the Shells were actually very kind to the Dakotas, helping them out, giving them rations, while the United States government was falling behind on its payments and enriching traders and Indian agents. So when New Ulm was attacked and for the most part razed, Shell's Brewery was unharmed. So it shows what having a little respect for your fellow human beings can do for you. And in Mankato, Minnesota, right outside the public library, you'll find a marker that says that this place, on this day, 38 men were hanged, because that is where those convicted for their part in the war, uprising were executed. So, this personally for me, this is fascinating because I grew up just north of New Ulm, and for years we would go down into New Ulm. It was the closest city of any real import. We'd go down there, we'd get groceries, take the kids out to the park, have good times, and a couple of times we took the walking tour before I even understood what was going on. But as I've grown older, I've appreciated more and more the history that's been preserved through the preservation of the old buildings that were standing and have been standing since the war. I also had my first job, college IT, in New Ulm, and I went to high school about 3 miles out from New Ulm. And Mankato, where the executions took place, was the next biggest city of import, so if they didn't have it in New Ulm, they maybe had it in Mankato, so we went to Mankato less frequently, but still rather frequently. And I have many good friends who go to school in Mankato. Fort Ridgely, as mentioned before, was a place we visited quite a lot growing up, both with the school and on our own time. And my grade school math teacher actually worked part-time over the summer at Fort Ridgely as an interpreter, telling the story of the battles of Fort Ridgely and the war in general to anyone who would stop by and listen. You can still go to the Lower Sioux Agency and the Upper Sioux Agency. They're both Minnesota historical sites. You can still visit Fort Ridgely. Most of the buildings are gone, except for one commissary, which stands as the visitor center, but their foundations are visible. You can visit the city of New Ulm. You can walk around the 2-block area that was barricaded off. You can see a replica of some of the barricades. You can visit the Brown County Historical Museum and see the murals that great artist Anton Gog painted after the fact of the Battle of New Ulm. By the hospital, you can find a historical sign that says the Leavenworth Rescue Expedition. So some settlers from New Ulm set out to rescue friends and family at Leavenworth, but they were ambushed and mostly killed. You can find in the area settlers' cemeteries where those who were executed by the Dakota were laid to rest for good. It's a terrible thing, war, and the cold hard fact is that neither side can be right. The United States government was absolutely atrocious in its dealings with the Dakota peoples. Unscrupulous in any way. They were so far from scruples that even had they pulled out a spyglass, they could not have seen them, for they were over the horizon. Promising and then taking away, a bait and switch game with people who spoke not the same language, relying on interpreters who would often distort what was being set forth purposefully to defraud an entire people, their history, their way of life, their homes. But one cannot condone the actions of the Dakota during the war as well. Slaughtering hundreds of civilians, raising a large amount of farmsteads, towns, settlements. It is truly a terrible thing to look back on. But without looking back on it, it's tough to look forward. For those who forget the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them. And I, for one, would rather learn from the past than be doomed by it. And with that, as I trudge through these 4 inches of slush on the sidewalk, I will wrap it up. Wish whoever is listening this a good day. Or a good night. Really any amount of good time.